Hi, everybody. Pastor Brent here. I want to do a quick sermon in a nutshell from Luke chapter 17 for the message that was given October the 2nd at River of Life Church. So I want to just look at verse 10 and we'll go from there, where Jesus says to the disciples, "In the same way, when you obey me, you should say, 'We are unworthy servants who have simply done our duty.'" This idea of unworthiness or unprofitable servants, that word is it's an economic word as opposed to a psychological word. So Jesus isn't saying that you are meaningless or have low value. What he's saying is that you have not earned more than what you were supposed to. It's like going to work every day and doing your job. We don't expect to be thanked for doing what we're paid to do. That's our job. And so Jesus says that as we follow him and as we do everything that God asks us to do, that Jesus asks us to do, instead of saying, "Hey, look at me, look what I've earned," we need to be understanding that we are in a deficit position with God, and we are forgiven by Jesus Christ through the cross. And therefore, everything we do is not to build up or to add into some kind of special treatment from God, but rather it's just simply what we were supposed to do in the first place. Now, from there, I moved into 1 Corinthians chapter 4, where Paul takes this idea of being a servant and a steward, and we see various characteristics of what that means. The question needs to be asked, well, what does it mean to be a good servant? Paul calls himself a doulos to Christou, a servant or a slave of Jesus Christ. I drew from Luke's gospel with the story of Mary, where she calls herself a chedoule, it's a feminine form of that word doulos, slave. I am the slave of the Lord. And we often translate that as servant because we find that more palatable to our modern mindset. But yet the word really does mean slave, in the sense of the ownership of you is in the hands of someone else. And throughout the New Testament, this is the understanding that Christians are to have with respect to their relationship to God. He is our master. He is our Lord, which means we are douloi. We are slaves. We are bondservants. We are in the ownership, in the household of our master, of our Lord. And so what are some of the characteristics of a person who is a doulos to Christou, a slave of Jesus Christ? Well, the first thing we see in 1 Corinthians 4 is this idea of faithfulness. And the NRSV translates that as trustworthy. And so the first thing about a person who is a servant of God, and of course in 1 Corinthians 4, Paul does not use the word doulos there. He's using a different word, which means underling, actually, someone who's underneath the authority of another. But the same idea is there. Paul's point is that he's not an autonomous agent in the world. He is under the authority of God, under the authority of Jesus Christ. And so he does what he's told to do. And so he talks about faithfulness or trustworthiness. And I mentioned in the message on Sunday how, this word pistos, it has so many different shades of meaning, and it's translated in various ways. And the week before, when I was looking at John chapter 15, this idea of faithfulness, of being faithful, we looked at it in terms of being loyal. And we referred to Matthew Bates' book about, allegiance, how pistos can be understood in the sense of allegiance and loyalty. Here we see faithfulness. And of course, this word is also used in Matthew 25, where Jesus says in the great judgment, or the king, I guess, in that passage, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And I was just drawing the attention to the fact that when we say faithful, sometimes we just think of hanging in there, of just, keeping going, of being on that treadmill and just keeping going. And that certainly is a sense of faithfulness. However, the idea of trustworthiness, of being trustworthy, brings out a different dimension of that, in that the idea there is that you're doing things which would generate trust in the person who is giving you things to do. Whereas faithfulness, in that story where the master gives the slaves a different money, and the one and doubles it and makes a whole bunch, other doubles it, the smaller portion, and makes a bunch of money for their master. And then the other guy digs a hole in the ground and buries his treasure because he's afraid he might lose something. And sometimes the faithfulness that we think of in terms of being faithful is more akin to that person who buries their treasure in the ground. Just hang in there, just hold on. And instead of the trustworthiness, where I would want to give you my money to invest because you are trustworthy and you will make me money. You will grow my assets, so to speak. And Paul talks about how we need to be servants of God, where there is that trustworthiness in our nature, that our what we do would make people trust us in terms of what we are called to do for Christ. And mostly, of course, that God would look to us and see us as trustworthy servants. The second thing I pointed out from the 1 Corinthians 4 passage was that there is an accountability. Paul talks about how he doesn't even judge himself, because what difference does it make whether he criticizes himself or lets himself off the hook? What matters is what God says, because he is an underling, as he points out. He's under the authority of another. All that matters is what God says. All that matters is Jesus Christ pleased with his service? And so he doesn't even criticize himself. And given his Pharisaic background, I'm sure Paul had all kinds of critical inner thoughts for himself. I mean, many of us do. We are critical of ourselves and of what we do, and we can be perfectionist at times, and we can dig too deep into things because we're afraid that we're going to maybe not do that well, and so we overdo it sometimes. We get critical of ourselves. And I'm sure Paul struggled with that. We see a bit of that in Romans 7, where Paul is talking about all his conscience and how he doesn't seem to be able to do the things he wants to do. And so there is this idea of accountability. Now, it's not accountability to the Corinthian church. It's not even accountability to himself. Paul says he is accountable to God. And of course, we love to think of the last day in terms of God wiping away every tear and no more pain, no more suffering. We are yearning for that experience in reality. However, Paul says that before we get into that spot, there is this time of judgment. And we read that in Jesus as well, where every word that's spoken in secret will be, announced from the rooftops, and everything done in secret will be, made known. And so there is this sense in which we have an accountability to God for the actions, the deeds done in the body, as Paul would say. Now, it's not a salvation judgment. It's not whether or not we're saved. It's more or less to just determine in our hearts and to everyone else that we are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ, not by works, not by what we've done. And that will become very evident in the final judgment, when all we can do is throw ourselves down before the feet of Jesus Christ and plead his mercy in our lives. Do it now, and and do it every day, because that's ultimately what everything hangs on in our lives, is the mercy of God. And then finally, in that passage in Corinthians, I looked at this idea of sacrifice, that Paul was suffering. He was in prison. He had been beaten. He had been maligned. He, slandered. And he talks about how he responds in each one of these cases. And we see the humility of Paul. And really, that's what the whole message was rooted in, this idea of the humility that comes from acknowledging the truth of Luke chapter 17, where even when we've done everything that God has asked us to do, we are still unprofitable servants. We've only done what we were supposed to do. And how this flows out of Paul's life as an apostle, and we see that in his faithfulness and trustworthiness. We see that in his sense of accountability to God. He knows who his master is. He's not trying to please everybody. He's not trying to please all the people. He's listening to God. He's listening to the command of Jesus in his life, and he is focusing on that. And then finally, that there is this sacrifice that means. When you are willing to do the hard work for God, there's going to be sacrifice. People are going to say things about you. People are going to question your motives. People are going to question all kinds of things about you. But yet, when you know who your master is, and when you're proving yourself to be trustworthy to your master, you carry on and you do the work that God has called you to do. And so all of this flows out of that initial understanding of ourselves as not being self-made people, not being extraordinary in ourselves, but rather that even after we do a tremendous job, we've only done what we were supposed to do with the gifts and the calling that God has given to us. And so that's the message in a nutshell, that from humility springs faithfulness, accountability, and sacrifice. Those are the marks of the true servant of the Lord.